Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Inga Cotton. I'm the founder and executive director of San Antonio Charter Moms. And I know lately we've been talking a lot about enrollment season, but there's lots of other questions about schools that parents have on their mind. And school safety has been a big topic for the last year or so. And we have a new perspective about school safety as a guest blog post on the blog today. That's at sachartermoms.com. So I want to introduce the author who's our guest on Charter Moms Chats today. So Mary Field is a board member at the International School of San Antonio. She also has been teaching Mandarin Chinese in San Antonio since 2015, and she's a repeat guest post. I'm always proud to share her content because she's so thoughtful. She's a really good researcher, and she often presents kind of surprising outcomes and kind of challenges people's assumptions. So for this post, she's tackling the topic of school safety, and I'm really excited for this discussion.
Thank you, Inga. I'm happy to be here.
Yeah. So I enjoyed like how you kicked off the post because you were talking about you were giving an example of like childproofing in your house, and that's part of safety, but also how different it is when you were talking to other parents about safety outside the home. So I was wondering, can you kind of explain like, that contrast, and so how do we think about school safety?
Yeah, I guess so. I mean, just in case people don't realize, a lot of times, when anybody writes for a publication, you start, and then it could be many months later, and there could be many drafts and iterations. So I have to kind of remember how I opened this piece. And if I remember it correctly, I started. Well, I kind of.
Well, you're talking about electrical outlets, right? And like putting
Yeah.
aerial covers in the plugs, right? But the fact that they're also like they're small enough to inhale, right? And then also about being in the bathtub, like kids are in the bathtub and you're trying to find something, but you don't want to take your eye off them while they're in the bathtub, right? So there's all these situations that we get in as parents that are super stressful.
Right. And I think what sort of got me thinking on this subject was, I did the same thing that everybody else does, before they bring home a child from the hospital or become a foster parent like I did, which is, you go around and you baby proof the house, right? It's like this little ritual. And a lot of people do it, and it sort of makes you feel like, okay, I am prepared now for this, as if you can prepare for something that you have no idea about. So I did the thing that everybody else does. I get the little plastic little doohickey that goes over the outlet. And, there's some outlets that are 5 feet off the ground in my house, and they got the little plastic thing too, even though there's no such thing as 5 foot tall toddlers. And then one of my previous foster sons, within a week, he had pulled off the little plastic thing. He was 18 months old and just put it in his mouth. And I was like, well, what was the point of this? I was so paranoid about little fingers going in the outlets, and it turns out it's a choking hazard. So like, okay. So yeah, that got sort of like the wheels turning in my head. But I think what I realized while, reflecting and researching this piece is it really is about control and how our perception of our own control affects how we feel about different situations. And I think what's so stressful about sending kids off to school or daycare or preschool or college, as the case may be, is that, in our own homes, we do feel like we have a sense of control of what happens. And then when kids are out in the world and at other institutions, we feel like we have a lot less control. And I think there is, it's a real challenge to accept that, yes, we don't control everything. And you can buy 5 different fire extinguishers for your house, but, you can't follow your kids into a 3rd grade classroom.
Right. Yeah. That's so like some of the data that you found is, like of all the, injuries that can happen to kids, there's a certain portion of that that's going to happen at school just because they spend a certain amount of their time on the school
Mhm.
campus, right? And then you look into the data, like, okay, what are those injuries happening at school, right? And it's kind of as you would expect, right? It does have to do with sports, and in sports that have more contact, and kids who may be more aggressive in how they play sports, right? Maybe male children.
Right. Yeah. So when I started digging into the data, uh, what I found, uh, I was sort of, you're always kind of hoping, like, oh, maybe I'll find something that's like really surprising here or very counterintuitive. And uh, what I found really, wasn't, anybody who's worked in a school, who's raised kids, if you ask them, they could probably guess pretty accurately. Okay, who gets more injuries at school, boys or girls? Like, it's boys. Um, and what are the most dangerous sports to play? It's contact sports. Regular tackle football is going to, have a lot more instances of injuries than, say, something like tennis. I think that it's good to be aware of these statistics and sort of calibrate your own expectations. So, for example, if you have sent a daughter off to school who's like extremely conscientious and well behaved, and then you send your son off to school, and suddenly you get all these accident reports and that you never got with your daughter, like, well, maybe you shouldn't panic just yet, right? Um, and then for sports, and really kind of like any physical activity, um, there is some inherent risk. What I did find interesting when I was researching this topic was that sort of globally, what seems to be very dangerous for people is exercise equipment. And kids
Interesting.
are kids aren't putting together like a treadmill at school, but they will eventually become adults. And I think we should all know that as human beings, we don't have a very good track record on being able to safely assemble our treadmills, stationary bikes, the old Bowflex. That had the highest injury rate of like almost anything I looked at. So
Wow.
full exercise equipment. But that's
That's interesting.
generally not something that kids are doing.
Right, right. But and one thing you brought up that people may not be aware of is sovereign immunity. That because schools are government entity, that you can't just go out and sue them. They have to, right? There has to be some. It only happens under some circumstance where there's a hole in the government immunity.
Right. Yeah. So this again, I think, you know, people should be aware of this. And, as an attorney, you know more about it than I do. But yes, schools in Texas, they have sovereign immunity, which is very convenient for them. My understanding is that it essentially means that they can't be sued unless they agree to be sued. So, I mean, maybe you can clarify that a little bit. But yeah, I mean, I think that, anybody who thinks like, oh, well, I'll just sue the school if anything happens, like, well, it's not quite that simple.
Yeah, yeah. There are exceptions to sovereign immunity, but yeah. And I'm not going to try to give legal advice on a podcast or blog, but yeah, but it's yeah. Basically, like it's not just it's not as simple as people might think it is.
Yes.
Yeah, yeah. But one thing you brought up too is that some of this data hasn't been updated for a while. Like that, it's sort of like people sort of thought they found the answer back in the 80s or 90s, and they seem content with that. It's like, well, wait a minute, like,
Yeah.
yeah.
I think you find this a lot in journalism. And I, wouldn't call myself a professional journalist. I write things on a pretty narrow topic. But I've heard it called sort of like zombie statistics, where people just keep citing the same thing over and over and over. And that's basically what I found. I can't remember it off the top of my head, but it was something like in the range of maybe about 15%, 18% of childhood injuries happen at school. And then you try and find the study where that comes from, and then you just find more articles that cite it, and then another article that cites the same thing, and then you keep pulling the thread out of the sweater, and it's from a study from the early 90s, and that people just keep citing it over and over and over again. And perhaps somebody who's doing a similar article could find more updated research, but I didn't. And we all have limits to how much we can dig, right? So it was noticeable that there just wasn't really updated research on this topic. And I can only speculate that it's perhaps a little difficult to get data, let's say, from hospitals. Do they collect where the injury happened? Do they not collect information on where the injury happened? Do they categorize it differently? And so on. So it may just genuinely be hard to do this kind of research. I think there's definitely an interest. Every parent I know cares about this topic. But I think you see that a lot, particularly in anything to do with the American system, because we are a federation of states. Different states do things differently, so getting like a big collection of data from the entire country it's often really complicated.
Yeah. Well, I think it's a good, just for, like, I want our readers to be astute, good students of like what they read, being skeptical about what they read, and being aware of zombie statistics, that like the same study may be getting repeated over and over again, and maybe nobody's putting the resources into updating that. And so just sort of be like, don't necessarily take statistics at face value. And I appreciate that about how you write, is that you kind of put things in context. And then also, like, this is a good segue, like the next section of your post, you talk about in gun violence in schools, and there is a lot of data collection on it, but there's also a big asterisk about it, because some of these instances aren't what we think of as, right, like there's these really big tragic events that grab the headlines. We remember the names of the locations, what schools, the cities these happened in. But there's a lot of other things that show up as gun violence in schools that are not the things that grab the headlines.
Yeah. And, I do want to make it clear, like, it's all bad. Like, all the gun violence is bad. And we would be way better off if it didn't happen. But one thing I noticed while doing this research is you do see a lot of statistics that get repeated, and there's one I think that you see a lot. The number is something like over 3,000 school shootings since, and I forget the year, but it's a 4-digit number. It's alarming. And this comes from, it's called the K-12 school shooting database. And this database, the raw form was shared with me. So I do have to, say thank you to the researcher who puts this together. I think basically he does this on his own. So I do have to give appreciation to him and to thank him for sharing his research with me. And this database does get widely cited, and it's the source of this, 3,000 plus shooting number. But the big asterisk is that it includes every time a firearm is discharged in or even near a school. And this includes shootings that happen at night, in July, on the weekend. So I think framing this issue with those statistics in mind as being a school problem, I think it's really unfair to the people who are sort of tasked with solving this issue in the schools, because it really looks like a society issue. And to say that, school administrators, teachers, districts, the TEA, that sort of they're responsible in some way for reducing that number, that's in the thousands, when really it includes an altercation that may be, and some of them it was a quarter mile away. And when we're talking about, urban areas, like that, I'm thinking of one's, public school in San Antonio that I know very well. And, across the street is a huge apartment building. Down the street are businesses. A quarter mile away could be the other side of a highway, like expecting school leaders to prevent gun violence in like that wide of like sort of a catchment area. I think it's really unrealistic and unfair to them, because they literally don't control what happens down the street. And then sort of more importantly, I think it does sort of freak people out in a way it's just not helpful. Because like you said, the incidents that we're really concerned about and what we're really afraid of, well, we already know them. If you just sort of think, like, you can identify, easily 5 out of 10. If you thought about it for 30 seconds, 5 out of 10 of these mass shooter incidents that we've had in schools in America in the past, let's say, 10 years. Like, yeah, you could do it. Pencil and paper, you can remember it off the top of your head. Because they make the news, and because while there are too many of them, there are not so many. It is a much smaller number than this 3,000 plus that gets quoted.
Mm-hmm. And like you said earlier, all of these things are bad, right? Like the fact that there is so much gun violence in our society, that's bad, right? So like, we're not minimizing that, but looking at this data, and this is like, what's so like, I want everybody to read this blog post, because like, it just puts things in context. And like, in some ways, if we have, it's just going back to your childproofing thing. It's like, being a parent is terrifying, right? Like, we're all just trying to white knuckle our way through it. But if you have a little bit more data, then you can make rational trade-offs about how you spend your energy, what you worry about, right? Just understand the threats more realistically, and and be able to sometimes give yourself permission to just take a break from the worrying and just enjoy life and love on your kids and enjoy parenting.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And again, it is a terrible problem. And I think that's what this particular data set shows, this K through 12 school shooting database. And I should say there are other databases out there. I think the Washington Post has one or had one. And I think another one comes out of Stanford. So it's not the only one. But yeah, I think what it shows is that, there is a lot of gun violence, but sort of mapping that on to what happens at schools, like inside the school building or in the actual campus, what would reasonably be considered the campus, I think it's a little bit unfair.
Yeah.
Particularly for urban schools where like anybody can be walking down the sidewalk. It's not the school sidewalk.
Right. And like, so what this two thoughts, and I guess we'll deal with them in order. But like
Right.
you talk about with respect to gun violence in schools, like that the approach in Texas has been hardening school buildings. But then I think, okay, like talking about like, okay, is this actual school violence, or is this just gun violence in society? That I think when we think of gun violence in schools, we think of the connection to bullying, right? Let's talk about the hardening, and then we'll talk about the bullying, because they're all kind of interrelated.
Yeah. So school hardening refers to a lot of different strategies for, making schools safer. That can be security cameras, bulletproof glass, locking doors, locking classroom doors from the inside, having armed security guards, metal detectors, um, and probably a few other strategies that I'm forgetting. But that's kind of what we mean when we say school hardening. And I should say, kind of also at the outset, having security guards and doors that lock, you know, anytime you have a large building filled with people going in and out, a lot of these features make sense just for, general security. There's a saying that locks don't keep people out, they keep people honest. And I really can't think of, any sort of large public building, that, where it wouldn't make sense to have doors that lock, because we just can't, somebody's going to have sticky fingers, right? And security guards, if you've ever worked in like a large office building, hospitals, like all of these places, they have security guards. So nobody's suggesting that this isn't necessary. But what research has found, and this was a study, I believe, out of Ball State in Indiana, and it looked at a lot of data. I'm personally not going to comb through all of it myself, but they looked at a lot of data, and they found that largely that these measures, didn't really work. And I think this finding is important because, for a couple different reasons. But to start, I think that when people think about how they want to respond to a tragedy, the measures involved in school hardening, it feels really doable to say, okay, we're going to install locks on all the classroom doors, and we're going to have armed school security officers in every school for every minute of the school day. So it does feel like you're doing something, and I see that appeal. I think that sort of the however is like, none of this is free, right? So if we're dumping money into solutions that like don't have a good evidence base behind them, like that's actually not really the smart move, even if in the moment it does make us feel better. And then I think for the school hardening itself, I think it is also a bit of a distraction. I think there are sort of maybe not solutions, but I think we should think about strategies that are maybe a little less concrete, But again, I spent a long time looking at information about these incidents. And one thing you do notice is almost everybody, um, you know, almost everybody who commits these types of crimes is a young man with a deeply, deeply troubled background. I maybe missed it, but there is not a single person who was living with both of his biological parents. Maybe there was a couple in the data, and I missed it, but the vast majority, and nobody wants to cast aspersions or blame single parents. Like it's all hard, but I think we have to be really clear-eyed when we look at these things that yeah, there are there's indicators, and that's one of them. Long histories of having trouble at school, just baseline not doing well, a lot of truancy, just kind of every issue in the book that they would send you to the guidance counselor about, kind of like in my day. And then more so with mental health diagnoses. And again, a lot of people have mental health diagnoses, like I do too. But I think we have to get serious about helping young men. And the data that I didn't look at for this piece, but I am certainly aware of, is the young men of society, like they're not doing so great. So I sort of wrapped up this research thinking, like, I really do deeply understand why people, they want to have steel doors and things like that. But the things that are actually really accessible to us that seem to be really overlooked are, are we paying attention to the young men in our lives? And hey, the young women deserve attention too, but in this particular topic, it seems like where the most risk is with young men for whom things are not going well. And I think this applies also to all the other gun violence that's that I think is maybe not fair to categorize as being school violence. I would suspect that things are not going well for those young men either. And it is, again, it's mostly young men.
Yeah. Well, and this is
vast majority.
Yeah, this is what I appreciate about your research, is that it's like we should be making decisions based on evidence, right? So if school hardening helps us feel better, and yes, we should have good procedures and stuff, but is that for that amount of cost, is that really going to make us safer? And the evidence doesn't show that. So and like you said, like trying to understand like what is causing these young men to feel so disturbed and to act out in these ways, and like could that make the most difference? And I know you also address you talked about bullying in the article. I don't want to rush you along if you have more to say about like the violence in society, but I think that there are a lot of assumptions that people make about bullying, and right, like how much is in-person bullying, how much is cyberbullying, like how much, like how many kids are impacted versus how many kids are like chronic victims of bullying, how many kids are chronic perpetrators of bullying, right? So like the data like doesn't always echo as much like what people's expectations are, as much as say with, oh yeah, it's boys playing football, we get hurt, right?
right. Yes. So I remember very clearly, from the 90s, the narrative after Columbine was, it was about bullying and school bullying be a problem. Um, Now, one of those things is true that school bullying is definitely a problem. But a, a lot of hours were spent in the post Columbine investigation, and it is very clear, and you can check my citations that it just wasn't a motivating factor in Columbine. But the narrative um, is out there now. That horse left the stable, and now we live in a world where we feel like that was the cause, even though factually that just isn't true. So over the past couple decades, again, a lot of money and a lot of legislation has been poured into either what's called anti-bullying or bullying prevention. And as as a person, my instincts going into this were, thank goodness I am too old to have experienced cyberbullying in school, because that sounds really scary, and that's something that you know I I don't even know how I would handle that. And going back to our earlier theme of control, with my previous foster son, we had all the controls on his tablet, so you could shut it down remotely. That's kind of cool, and it pops up on your phone. Do you approve downloading this app? And that works for kids who are in elementary school, but are you really going to do that with your high schoolers?
Yeah, like Bark or Life 360, like these are pretty intrusive, but yet they're still holes, right?
Oh, yeah, and eventually, like they're gonna have to go out into the world by themselves, and like, are you gonna have parental controls on their phones when they're at college? Like, eventually, maybe. Maybe people do.
No, yeah, there are 20 somethings who are still on Life 360 with their parents. Personally, I think that's going a little far, but it's not. I mean, it's not my life. I don't know what their circumstances are, but I think there's a point where you need to not know as a parent. Let them live their life. Yeah, and how do we prepare them for that, right? Because we can't protect them from all stress. Like, they need to learn to adapt, but we don't want them to experience like trauma or right, or the way cyberbullying can be like a 24/7 phenomenon, right? Where it's
Right.
like they're getting it in person at school, and then after hours they're getting it on Instagram or on text.
Mhm. Yeah. So I had all this in my head, and I looked into it, and it turns out that cyberbullying not as common as good old fashioned in person bullying. So I thought that I was just, some dinosaur who did not understand the full extent of what kids are dealing with. But as it turns out, sort of, what I remember is still the primary issue. So in some ways, I felt like that was good news. Like, okay, cyberbullying, it hasn't taken over. However, we have poured a lot of resources into bullying prevention, and the data, again, it's really hard to tell if anything really works. I think if you talk to bullying prevention experts, they'll say, well, okay, no, we do know what works and what doesn't work. I think there's widespread agreement that zero tolerance policies don't work. That's a bad idea. And that what does work, sort of creating that culture of like kindness and tolerance and acceptance, that it's a long project, and it's something that you're going to have to work on over the years. Still, when you look at it, it's a little scary. Like the number of children who report experiencing some kind of bullying is at school. It's the majority of kids. Now, when I looked into this, one thing that really jumped out at me was that bullying has a very broad definition. And one that, in at least for most definitions I found for American institutions, relies on saying that it's bullying when there is a power difference between the children or a perceived power difference. And, my feeling is, well, if it's just a perceived power difference, then like you could say anything, right? Anything could be. I think with kids, we think of the classic scenario from the movies of like the jock on the football team, like taking the nerd kid and hanging him up like on the door of his locker. And that, okay, is sort of obvious. The jock is like the popular kid. He's on the football team, so he's physically stronger. He's got more friends. Like, okay, yeah, he's got the power in that situation. Okay, fair enough to call it bullying. But I think in human relations, and kids are humans, right? It can be, I think it's not always so straightforward who has power and who doesn't. So you have this really broad definition of bullying, and I think a lot of things can get caught up in that. And it's such a broad issue if you frame it that way, that almost kind of any conflict between kids, you can characterize it that way. And I think if you take any conflict between kids and you characterize it as bullying, you've created a huge problem, like, because we're never going to eliminate conflict between children because, like I said, they are human.
They're human. Yeah.
We're just not all always going to get along with each other.
Right.
And you've created this, we have this mandate that we're supposed to, prevent bullying. And then if we call every conflict bullying, or there's the potential to call every conflict bullying, then we have to eliminate every single conflict. And then again, if you think about it, like that's also, not great in a lot of ways, because we have vicious, horrible bullying that makes kids not want to go to school, which is terrible. Not only because it's a miserable experience to go through as a child, but because like they need to go to the place where they're going to learn, right? Like they still need to learn math. And sort of the more mundane conflicts, kids do need to learn how to work through that. And I think what we also know from research and psychological research is that when adults intervene in kid problems, we are taking away the potential for them to learn how to solve their own problems. And we're creating a situation where it's going to make things worse, to put it bluntly, because once you add that third person to a conflict, and us adults who've had long lives and careers, like, I think sort of we can all think of a situation in which adding a third person, particularly a third person in authority, like, made something worse. And that is called triangulation. And there's plenty of research that says, like, yeah, that's bad. And again, if you're an adult watching this right now, you can think of a situation where you had sort of a friction with somebody at work, and then there was an appeal to the boss or HR, and instead of like kind of working through together, like, okay, how can we not get on each other's nerves, suddenly it's a huge deal, and it's the kind of thing that people quit over. And yeah, and if kids start doing that, like, again, they're not learning healthy ways to deal with conflict.
Right. So like you give some examples in the post, like you're on the phone, right? You're in your car, you're on the phone with an expert, like a researcher.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then, right. And like, it sort of explains like what not to do. Right. So you're just, like, you're on the phone with this expert researcher. You have to pretend to be like a schoolyard bully.
Yeah, this was super interesting. Because, in the course of my research, I talked to, big centers that, do these programs where they go into schools and everybody gets the handout and there's the assembly. And then, I wanted to talk to somebody who had a sort of a different approach. And I found, I believe he's mostly retired, but a school psychologist, Izzy Coleman. And I spoke to him over the phone, and for people who've never written any articles before, one thing that you learn when you do this is some people you interview, they provide great information, it's wonderful, very helpful. And then sometimes you interview people and you can't write down what they say fast enough because they're so personable and they're so funny and pithy and great. And Izzy Coleman is one of these people. So he was sort of a delight to talk to, but I also think that, he has a very good point, which is essentially that all kids are going to have conflict at school. With a really broad definition of bullying, you can call all of it bullying. Yep. But there are going to be a minority of children who get bullied relentlessly, mercilessly, who have a horrible time of it. This is not the majority. He says it's about 10%, which kind of aligns with other, big data sets that I found where it was similar, like, around 10% of children report being chronically bullied. And, you can do things like have the school assemblies and do the handouts and say, we're going to have this culture of kindness, or, there's a million different programs, and they're all like nice and teach kids to do good things, but it's not going to help the kid who, like, at 7:00 tomorrow morning is refusing to go to school because he hates it and is miserable. So what can we do to help that kid? So Mr. Coleman walked me through his program, and he said to me in the middle of our interview, he's like, okay, well, bully me. And as somebody who was an educator for a long time and spent many years just saying like, let's be nice, kids. It's very awkward to try and like access that part of yourself. What I found actually to be very revealing was I could do it. Like I I can remember the mean things. And then after a while, I was like, yeah, I could do this. I could bully this stranger on the phone. I heard his dog barking, and I said, your dog doesn't even like you. It was the meanest thing I could think of, but I was like, yeah, I was real creative, Mary. Good job. And so I think, we do, yeah, we are talking about human nature. So in any case, I start blowing this guy over the phone, and then he role plays with me. He's the victim, I'm the bully, and he starts saying things, and I'm listening and thinking like, okay, all right. And I just kept going. And after a while, I did sort of understand his point, which was like this kid, air quotes, wasn't really helping himself. And then he said, okay, round two, keep bullying me and we'll try it a different way. And so I did, and it was easier to get into it this time, kind of knew what to say. And then his responses changed, and it was like, when you're at the boxing gym, I don't know, Inga, maybe you spent a lot of time at the boxing gym, maybe you've only seen one on TV, but there's like the little thing that you punch it.
Small bag. Yeah.
And it moves very quickly. And then there's the big punching bag,
Mm-hmm.
and it doesn't really move. And you punch it a couple times and you really wear yourself out. And that's what it felt like. I just felt so deflated, so worn out. This is not like, all right, I will admit, it was sort of quote unquote fun. the bully for round one, when the kid, air quotes, was just a victim. And then for round two, all the air was sucked out of me. And I thought, wow, okay. I'm not sure you could teach a kid how to handle a bully in like 5 minutes, but could a guidance counselor teach kids how to stand up for themselves in a way that empowers them, so they're not just waiting around for everybody else to learn to be nice? Like, that seemed really doable, actually. And it seemed like, yeah, it could really help a kid who, is taunted mercilessly and does would benefit from being able to sort of diffuse that situation the way that Izzy Coleman did in our kind of role play. And it really made me think that a lot of the bullying prevention is focused on, having everybody learn how to be polite and nice, which is good, right? We want everybody to have a sort of baseline of being polite and nice. However, for the short term of kids who have to go to school tomorrow and next week and next month, like, is there room for something else that empowers them? Because I think that is, really kind of like the flaw in these big, like, school-wide programs or creating the classroom culture, which again is good. You should create a classroom culture in which everybody is polite to each other, is kind, we're not discriminating. But kids who are chronic victims, like, I don't know if they have time to wait for us to solve human nature. And we should be able to empower people, I think. And that's really kind of what I walked away from this whole project thinking is we should really, if it's the lack of control that really freaks us out, for lack of a better term, perhaps what we should focus on is what we can control. And just to be really honest, I can't control what the other kids are like in the playground. I mean, some people try. They like hover over their 12-year-olds. But you can teach people how to stand up for themselves.
I think, and what you're sharing, I think is actually, I think like knowing the truth, like, and is a source of optimism, because like hopefully it could help parents to not take the approach of just trying to bubble wrap their kids, because then they can't grow, right? So part of it's like we can try to control and increase safety, but like part of parenting is gradually releasing control and trusting that our kids have the tools so that if they are in a situation where they're getting picked on, they know how to be the large bag, not the small bag, and how to deflate, and to, just break, like just stop, make the game so unsatisfying for the bully.
And that's exactly what it was. It was, it made it really, really unfun.
Yeah.
Really remarkable.
Yeah. No, I think that's, and what a great example too, because it's not about the victim like hitting back or escalating or being physical about it, right? It's more like having situational awareness, having a set of tools. And like you said, maybe they can't learn it in 5 minutes, but with some coaching, right? And it's way better than trying to change human nature, because people have been trying that for a long time, and progress is slow. So
and that's what one of the many quotes that I wish could have made it into the piece, and maybe it didn't, I just forget. But when I was talking to Izzy Coleman, he said, we can't expect every child on planet Earth to go to school and act like a completely moral being. We can't change human nature. Like, we don't expect adults to go anywhere and just be nice all the time. Like, we can't even get people to return their shopping carts at HEB. So to expect, 9-year-olds to not say anything mean.
Yeah, no, that's not going to happen. So, right. But we can try to help the victims to, protect themselves in constructive ways. Right. And then that's preparing them for being, independent adults eventually, which, right. Because we can't protect them from everything. And there's always unintended consequences, right? So it's like, oh, look, I'm going to child-proof all the outlets. Well, yeah.
And then they try and eat it. So
right. But no, I think, like you said, like having like school, so like character week, it's great because it's to improve the school climate. And also, like you talked about, like, hey, it's good to have safe schools. It's good to lock the doors and have people keeping an eye on things. Like, these are all good things, but they may not have the effect that we hope for, right? They may not have like a total elimination. Like, that's not right. That's not going to happen. So we need to work on both sides.
Yeah, and I think it should be very empowering for people to think about, okay, well, what do I have control over? And it is your reactions to things in the case of bullying. And then, if we live in a society that is more violent than we would like, we live in a society where there's, a lot of disaffected young men, like, well, I know young men You do too, probably. Like everybody has a 17, 18, 19-year-old man in their lives that, you can talk to him. and, and, if you're overbearing about it, they'll probably run away. But I think, when reading about all of these, tragedies, I do really think that one high quality relationship would have made a difference.
Yeah, that there were in all these stories there were missed opportunities, right? Like, so if a child
And
is
multiple.
repeatedly truant, right,
Yeah.
that's a red flag. It shows up, or if they have a diagnosis and they're not getting treatment for it, right? Whether that's they need accommodations at school or it's a mental health diagnosis, right?
Yep, absolutely.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think so. In the last section of the article, I think was, I mean, I love so much to love about it, but like this part was really stimulating because you talk about things that are right. So people, we focus on certain things, and then there's things that we don't pay enough attention to, right? Of like things that actually do work, right? So like you mentioned about that, like drowning is maybe more common than people realize, right? Like we focus more on gun violence, but drowning is a real threat for young kids, right? And then there's
Right.
things like like the gun lock distribution, like that's actually like there's things that make more of a difference. So, like, that was like I feel like the article is really hopeful because it's like if you the more you know, the better prepared you are.
Yeah. Yeah. I think, and there's going to be regional differences, but for us here in San Antonio,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, the pool. Really. One thing I learned from this research is that drowning does not look like what people think it looks like. I, from my interviews, and my kind of own, I guess, assumptions, I think it's fair to say a lot of people expect it to be sort of like splashing and yeah, like it'll be some sort of like cartoon version of drowning. But more often than not, it is silent. And one thing I did learn is the invisible ladder. Have you heard of this?
No,
That
no.
a lot of drowning victims, maybe not all of them, but a lot, look like they're trying to climb a ladder.
Interesting.
So that's something to look for when you're at the pool, is somebody who looks like they're trying to climb an invisible ladder. And really, the safety measures that people can take, one is, yeah, of course, to educate yourself about what drowning looks like. And I think another one is to, be really realistic about what you can do. And having adults by the pool is not enough, because if everybody's like, oh yeah, we're here, it's fine, it's safe,
Right.
and then you're talking, looking at your phone, somebody's like flipping burgers, like, well, then you're not paying attention to what's
Right.
happening at the pool. So
You'll miss
you're gonna miss the
that.
invisible
Yeah.
ladder. Yeah. So if you do have like the pool party or the get together with kids swimming, somebody should be designated to watch the pool, and it's going to be really unfun. It's going to, yeah, it's going to not be great to be the person who's not drinking alcohol and who's just by themselves, not talking to other people. Like, yeah, it's not fun. But I think that is what we have to do if you are serious about preventing drowning. And of course, teaching your kids how to swim. It's all sort of a blur if I researched this for this piece or something else, but a big recommendation is to repeat swim lessons every season.
Mm.
I mean, I don't know if you have to take your 16-year-old for, their 13th year of swim lessons, but when you have little kids, and you can teach them how to swim really young.
Mhm.
There's plenty of places you can take them. But to teach them how to swim, the next year do some more swim lessons. The year after that, more swim lessons. So they really build up a base and they don't forget the skills that they had.
Yeah, yeah. And I know there's some great organizations locally, like Miss Tristan Foundation and the like Mitchell Chang. There's organizations that are, families that have suffered tragedies, and they're trying to educate kids. And I know like the city of San Antonio has, Parks and Rec. They have like pools where they have affordable swim lessons for kids to learn. So, it's like the more you know, like, we can make good decisions for our own kids. I have this platform, SU Charter Moms. I can shed good information and hopefully help parents get out of, kind of this feeling of paralysis, right? Or just being
Yeah.
afraid to have, or like, investing a lot of resources in things that maybe don't have the benefit that we like. So like you mentioned an example of like a bulletproof shelter for a classroom, right? Or like
Yeah.
backpacks with bulletproof panels and stuff. And it's like, oh goodness, is this where we're at?
Is this, yeah. That, I mean, just the money for the classroom pod, it's just highly impractical. But what I learned from this was that gun locks, you can get them for free in San Antonio. No questions asked. You will have to either, hopefully I did provide the link in the post, but you will have to find the site where you can pick it up for free, or they're $10 on Amazon. And as somebody who, this is not my thing, but when I was researching, I couldn't quite believe that this little $10 tool was, enough to lock a firearm. So I called a local gun shop and I said, please explain this to me. I don't know anything. I figured the gun shop people, they're going to know everything. And they said, yeah, this little, it's like a big loop.
Yeah.
Something that looks like a padlock.
It's like a mini version of a bike lock. It's like a guinea pig sized bike lock.
Yeah. That's a good comparison. And they said, yeah, it will lock pretty much any firearm. So we need to make sure that people are using them, because when kids get their hands on firearms, use them, they are almost universally unlocked.
Right.
So they need to be locked.
Right. And kids are humans, but they're small humans and they don't have the moral sense, right? So it's like, again, putting on my lawyer hat, like, on common law, like, this is going back to the Middle Ages, like any person age 7 or younger, they cannot form criminal intent. Right. Like, it's just like they have there's such a thin wall between reality and make believe, right? That, like, how do we even know, like, because like they see movies and they see, picture books or, comic books or stuff with violence, and or like you're in a game and you respawn, right? Like, so there's no sense of a permanent consequence. Like, they don't really have a sense of death or permanence the way adults do. They haven't experienced grief that way, right? And even like 7 to 14, it's like, it's kind of murky, like what kind of intent or mens rea, like they don't, right? So there's a reason why we don't impose adult consequences on the very young children who, commit these kinds of crimes, because they can't form intent, they can't premeditate the way we hold adults morally responsible for things like that.
Yeah, and it is, as adults, it is our responsibility to take care of our belongings. And that includes firearms if you have them.
Yeah. And right, and something like a $10 tool, or free, depending on where you get it. Right. If we can just, make sure people are aware of it and that they use it. And like, yes, it might be a hassle, but but you could be saving a life. It's that kind of conscientiousness that's so priceless. That's the hardest part, is the monitoring, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, there's so much good stuff in this article. Okay, so I'm looking at my draft here to make sure we don't. I guess yeah. Like I mean, like one thing you highlight is the fact, and we've talked about this elsewhere on the blog too. Is just that like like we talked about this in your preschool post, right? About like how much disruption the pandemic caused in young children's lives, and but it affects like all children, like more digital life, less in-person interaction, a sort of degrading of social skills, and a lack of togetherness, and so it's like how do we support mental health, in a world where things are just so disrupted, right? Because we need kids to have good mental health and good social skills so that they can relate to each other, and hopefully that will prevent bullying and prevent violence, and make a safer community.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think it's a good thing that there is more and more attention paid to this issue. Um, I think with the pandemic, it's going to be a few years before we have the full picture of the effects. I think that with sort of the idea of safety and how it connects to things like social media, and our social lives of children, I think it's probably pretty complicated. There is, some evidence that social media is terrible for young people. I think that a lot of people who are more skeptical might remember the panic about video games, and before that, panic about television, and how that it didn't really, that conclusion didn't really hold, that it was just totally toxic for children's development. Perhaps social media is different. I don't think we really know just yet. I think what we do know is, from sort of like the realm of mental health, is that humans, we tend to be happier and more well adjusted when we have a sufficient number of high quality relationships in our lives. I think that really holds up. And that's a very consistent finding, that we are social creatures, we are social animals, and good relationships make a really big difference, whether you're rich or you're not so rich, levels of education, living in northern Alaska versus a big city on the East Coast. Having high quality relationships, really does seem to be what's good for people. So how do we get there? And I think that it, does mean that we have to make sure that our kids do have in-person social interactions. Again, there is some evidence that, the video games, I don't know if your kids are into this, but I definitely have at least one nephew who, like, they wear like the headset, they're talking to each other, maybe that's good enough. But we certainly know that, yeah, face-to-face, in-person interactions are great. And I think as part of that, so that they learn to kind of handle things, is, you do have to let them have reasonable amounts of friction with other kids too, so that they can work it out and, develop reasonable expectations about how the world is going to work.
Yeah. I thought of something related to the gun lock thing, which is also like one thing you mentioned in the post, is to like parents should not be afraid if their child is going to another household to inquire what is the gun safety situation at that household. And that can be awkward to bring up, but I guess I just blanket, I'm just going to grant everybody watching this video permission. Like, go ahead and ask. Go ahead and ask. And if that affects that friendship, well, I mean, just I don't know. You need to know where your kids go, right? When they're young, when they're not old enough to necessarily make good choices for themselves, right?
Right. Yeah. And I think, I mentioned that because somebody told me that her pediatrician told her to do this. And then, nobody said the same thing to me. So I thought, okay, there is really, inconsistent advice out there that some people are being told this and some people are not. Um, and yeah, you're right. It's definitely going to be awkward. And maybe it will feel like you're sort of like tipping your hand politically, but I don't think it has to be that way.
Right. Well, I know folks who are, adamant about gun rights and love hunting and things like that, and they're really good about locking up their firearms. So I feel like gun safety should not. It's like, I mean, I know it's a very complicated issue, but like I think everybody should be able to agree on gun safety, right? It's not that's different than what types of guns people should be able to own or or this or that. It's a separate question. Like, and a lot of gun owners are very adamant about responsible gun ownership and keeping their firearms safe.
Yeah. And I think, again, and this is like a social skill, and we've talked we haven't maybe said it directly, but we've talked around this issue of developing social skills in kids.
Yes.
And I think this is also a social skill for adults, is like, how to, again, sort of like stand up for yourself and assert your own agency in the world. And still keep your friends, right? Like, you don't have to turn people off. Like, you can have this conversation in a way that, is not accusatory and not combative, not any of the things that we don't want it to be. Like, it can be done.
Mm-hmm. And there's a whole range of things too that, like, it's like I have friends whose kids have severe food allergies, right? And you need to ask, like, hey, are you going to keep the peanuts away, or families have different policies. Like, so like I've heard of instances of where, like, if a child is growing up in a very screen-free household, and then they go to their friend's house that's screen liberal, and then all they want to do is play with screens, so it's like, and that's something like the friends have to navigate. It's like, are you just here to borrow my screens, or are you actually my friend?
and what a valuable experience to have, when you're a kid, to think about, like, am I being used? Because I have bad news. Like, it's going to happen when you're an adult, right? People are going to be nice to you for the wrong reasons. And you're much better off if you've learned how to deal with it when the stakes are low.
Yeah. It's like you said, it's learning social skills. As adults, we can try to model pro-social behavior, but I'm human and I make mistakes, and we just have to, that's why, like dinner table conversation, or just having, like, or when you have a captive audience in the back seat, and you just try to find out what happened that day. And, I talk about my day and mistakes I made or successes I had, and, just try to help them navigate. But, with the goal being, like, there's, like we talked about, control, like there's so much we can't control. So, right, we can just try to look at data and figure out where do we put our energy, and then just try to prepare our kids as best we can for what they're going to encounter. Yeah. Wow. Well, I really appreciate how, like, there was so much breadth to how you approach. I mean, I know when we were kind of mapping this out, I was like, yeah, school safety. And, like, I had no idea, the different, like, trails that you were going to go down with this post, but I'm so thankful that you did, because I learned a ton from it, and it helped put things in perspective. And I'm really proud to have it on our site, because I think this will be really helpful to our readers, who have kids of lots of different ages, but especially the folks with very young children.
Mhm.
And because with very young children, you can control more of their environment, and then you have to progressively, let them go more and more, especially like, so the idea of taking kids to kindergarten, with the idea that, gun violence in schools could happen at any moment, like that's terrifying, but like hopefully this gives parents a sense of like how infrequent those events actually are, and then what are some meaningful steps that they can do, to help their kids be safer.
Yeah, well, thank you for saying that. And yeah, I don't know where I'm going to end up when I start. You know, you just kind of have to, again, keep pulling that thread and see where it takes you. But I guess what I have taken away from this experience was, a better understanding of my own agency, and to um, think, I think sort of like the healthy approach is to think about, okay, what can I control? And for, all of these different areas, whether it is like, talking to another grown up and saying like, so like, how do you store your guns if you have them? And maybe it sounds really dopey, but often I find that if you have awkward questions, to like just practice saying them. So that's my little tip. Like seriously, when you're alone, just practice saying it, and then you have your rehearsal, so you know what you sound like when you ask these questions. And from things like bullying, that we really, really should do our best to empower kids to take care of themselves, because again, these are skills that will follow them all through their whole lives. Yeah,
It doesn't stop when you graduate high school.
No, you don't. And perhaps more so, you how to stand up for yourself. And then, of course, lastly, exercise equipment. Be careful, everybody. Just be careful when you're putting that treadmill together.
I had no idea. I'm gonna have to look that up. That's fascinating. Yeah. Yeah. Who know? Yeah. Who knew? Right. So some things were as we expected, and some things were like completely out of left field. But
Mm-hmm.
the more you know about safety, the better we can keep ourselves safe and keep our kids safe, and hopefully not scare ourselves out of our minds. And we can, just try to get out there and enjoy life. Enjoy the fun parts of being parent.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Yeah, great. Well, Mary, thank you so much. I'm so grateful. Actually, let me pop it up on the screen. So, shrmoms.com. So, Mary's guest post about school safety. Like, are there any new questions? Like, yes, there are new questions about school safety. Go read it. I encourage everybody to share it, because it has so many good ideas in it, so much good research, so many links. So you could, go get some free gun locks, and dig deeper into this data, because it. That's what helps us make sense of the world and make better choices.
Yep.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you for having me. It was a pleasure, as always.
All right, take care.